The job site was a mess all day, but I still stopped and picked up the oranges you like. Come sit with me for a minute. Tell me how your day went.
Stop it! Nasir, I can't be with a useless man anymore.
You actually mean that?
You don't make enough money. You don't have ambition. You bring nothing to this family anymore.
That's really all I am to you. After 11 years?
I'm tired, Nasir. It's all over.
Nasir stood frozen in the middle of that living room, the yellow light falling across his face. No anger, no argument, just a heavy silence, the kind that belongs to a man quietly worn down for over a decade. 9 days later, she filed for divorce. She thought she was walking away from a broken man, a useless husband with nothing left to lose. She had no idea that inside the bottom drawer of an old dresser, tucked beneath worn t-shirts, sat a business plan quietly waiting to bloom.
I'm Nasir Thompson, 38 years old. Born and raised in Bronzeville, on Chicago's South Side, in a two-flat my grandfather bought with cash he saved working the stockyards. My whole life, I believed one simple thing. If you show up, if you work hard, if you keep your word, everything else falls into place eventually. 11 years into my marriage, my wife looked at me from across our living room and told me I was useless. She didn't scream it. That's the part that still gets me. Nova said it the way you'd read a grocery list. Calm, tired, final. Nasir, I can't be with a useless man anymore. Here's the thing nobody tells you about the worst moment of your life. Sometimes it doesn't come with thunder. Sometimes it comes with the hum of the refrigerator in the next room and a glass of orange juice still sweating in your hand, because you'd poured it for her out of 11 years of habit before she even asked. I want you to sit with that image for a second, because there's more to it than heartbreak. There's a second layer to this story, a mistake Nova made that night, one she wouldn't understand the size of for another 12 months. And there's something I was already carrying, quietly, that she didn't know about either. 9 days after that conversation, she filed for divorce. Exactly 1 year later, Forbes put my name on a list of the top real estate entrepreneurs in the country, under 40. Before we get into the story, I want to ask you something. What would you do if the person who called you useless had to watch you build an empire from the wreckage they left behind? Stay with me. I'm going to tell you exactly how it happened. Every quiet year, every small humiliation, every decision that led to the night everything turned. It was a Tuesday in April, the kind of gray Chicago evening where the rain doesn't fall so much as hang in the air, deciding whether it's worth the trouble. I remember the sound of tires hissing on Michigan Avenue 3 blocks over, faint through the windows. I remember the porch light out front flickering. I'd meant to fix that fixture for 2 weeks and hadn't gotten to it, because I was pulling a double at the Home Depot on Cicero after finishing a 10-hour shift as a foreman on a job site in near South Side. That was my life back then. Up at 5 a.m., steel-toe boots by the door, thermos of coffee my mother used to call strong enough to wake the dead. Home by 4, shower, second job by 6. Nova worked marketing for a pharmaceutical company up in the Loop. Nice office, nice title. A view of the river she liked to mention. We'd bought the house together, a 2-story on the South Side, the kind of place with good bones and a porch swing that had been creaking since before either of us was born. The chain squeaking on the downswing, no matter how much oil I put on it. Our daughter, Zion, was 9, asleep down the hall that night, one arm flung over her stuffed rabbit, completely unaware her whole world was about to shift. I sat down across from Nova in my work clothes, dust still in the creases of my knuckles. She was dressed for one of her evenings, heels off by the door, blouse still pressed, like she'd rehearsed this. "You don't make enough money," she said. "You don't have ambition. You don't bring anything to this family anymore. I'm tired, Nasir." I didn't argue with her. That's what people don't understand about a man who's been quietly worn down for over a decade. A part of him has already started agreeing with the verdict before it's even read out loud. Somewhere underneath the numbness, a voice I recognized as my father's stirred up an old memory. Him standing in our kitchen the week before he passed, gripping my forearm with what strength he had left. "Son, a quiet man ain't a weak man. A quiet man's just saving his voice for when it matters." I hadn't understood him then. I was starting to. I want to tell you something I never told Nova. 2 years before that night, I was walking past her home office to bring her coffee, and I heard my wife on the phone with her best friend, laughing softly. "Nazir's sweet," she said, "but he's just a construction guy. He's never going to go anywhere." I stood in that hallway for maybe 10 seconds. My hand didn't shake, but my chest went tight in a way I still remember. That particular kind of hurt that doesn't announce itself. It just settles in and waits. Then I walked the coffee mug back to the kitchen, poured it down the drain, and went to my night shift like nothing happened. That's the kind of man I was raised to be, the kind who swallows it and keeps showing up. But I want you to remember that hallway, because it matters later. Here's what Nova didn't know, sitting on that couch, delivering her verdict like a judge reading a sentence. I had already started something. Small, quiet. Something I hadn't told a single soul about. Not my sister, not my pastor, not even myself most days, because saying it out loud felt like inviting failure to come faster. There was a manila folder in the bottom drawer of my dresser at that very moment, tucked under old t-shirts, with a business plan I'd been sketching out on my lunch breaks for months. She thought she was leaving a man with nothing. She had no idea what she was about to hand me the freedom to become. If you've ever been the one who gave everything and got called nothing in return, I need you to keep listening. Because in the next part of this story, you're going to watch what quiet men do with humiliation when nobody's paying attention. After the divorce, Nova kept the house, the car, and most of what we'd saved. The court granted me shared custody of Zion, but Nova fought it at every turn, filing complaint after complaint, claiming I wasn't a stable enough provider. I moved into a small one-bedroom apartment back in Bronzeville, 12 minutes by foot from the house I used to call home. Close enough that some mornings I'd walk past it just to see the porch light I'd never gotten around to fixing, now glowing steady, because apparently somebody else had finally changed the bulb. Every other weekend, Zion came to stay with me. She'd climb into my old pickup, backpack on her lap, and ask questions no 9-year-old should have to ask. "Daddy, why did Mommy say you're useless?" I'd grip the wheel a little tighter and tell her, "Sometimes grown-ups say things when they're hurting, baby girl. It doesn't make it true." But I'll be honest with you. Some nights, after I dropped her back off and pulled into the gravel lot behind my building, I'd sit in that truck with the engine ticking as it cooled, and I'd let myself cry. Exactly 60 seconds. I counted some nights, just to give myself permission. Then I'd wipe my face, straighten my collar even though nobody was watching, and go inside like a man who had somewhere to be in the morning. Because I did. You want to understand why I let myself be called useless for 11 years? Let me take you back 5 years, to when my father was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. I sold the last piece of land my grandfather left us, a lot out in Inglewood, to cover what insurance wouldn't touch. Nova told me not to sacrifice everything for a hospital bill. I did it anyway, because he was my father, and some things aren't up for negotiation. She never once said thank you. Not that year, not any year after. I used to wonder, lying awake some nights, whether my wife had learned that particular coldness from somewhere, or whether it had just always been in her. Her older brother had made partner at a bank up in Naperville before he turned 30. Sharp suits, a corner office, the kind of resume her family loved bringing up at Thanksgiving. Nova grew up being measured against him. Grades, looks, the man she eventually married. I think some broken part of her needed a husband who could stand next to that comparison and come out ahead. When I didn't, I stopped being a person to her and started being a problem to solve. That didn't excuse what she did, but it helped me understand it eventually, and understanding is its own kind of peace. That's the kind of marriage it had been. I gave, she measured. My sister Imani called me about 3 weeks after the divorce was final. Imani doesn't sugarcoat anything, never has, not since we were kids splitting the last piece of cornbread on my grandmother's porch. "Nasir," she said, "you have got to show Zion that her daddy is not useless. I mean it. That little girl is watching everything you do right now." That call sat with me for days. Then Pastor Raymond Brooks, who'd known our family since before I was born, mentioned a mentorship program running out of the West Loop. Real estate investors teaching guys from the neighborhood how to flip distressed properties, how to read a contract, how to see value where the market saw nothing but a boarded-up window and a collapsed porch step. I almost didn't go. I remember standing outside that building on a Thursday evening, still in my work boots, telling myself I was too tired, too old, too far behind to start something new. Then I thought about Zion asking me why her mother called me useless, and I walked in. There's a quiet moment I still think about from those early weeks. A Sunday evening, just me, alone in that small apartment. Papers from the mentorship program spread across my kitchen table. No television on, no music. Just the hum of the refrigerator, same as the night Nova had ended things. Except this time, the silence didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a held breath before a first step off a ledge you'd been standing on for years. I remember looking down at my own hands, calloused, a little scarred, the same hands Nova had once called just a construction guy's hands, and thinking, these hands built half the buildings on this side of the city. Let's see what they can build for themselves. A few weeks later, going through some boxes I hadn't opened since the move, I found an old USB drive Nova used to keep for backing up her phone. She'd always had a habit of leaving herself voice memos throughout the day, reminders, notes before client calls. And every couple of months, she'd dump the audio files onto that drive to clear space. I plugged it in mostly out of habit, not suspicion. Buried in a folder of old memos was a recording from 3 years earlier. Nova, talking to her brother on speakerphone while she thought she was alone in the kitchen. "Nasir's never going to be enough for me," her voice said, flat and certain. "He's a good man, but he's not going anywhere." I sat there in that little apartment and listened to it once. Just once. My jaw tightened, and for a moment the old hurt rose up hot behind my ribs. Then I closed the laptop, set the USB drive in a drawer, and made a decision that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with proving something to myself and to my daughter that no one could ever take back. I started small. A run-down two-flat on the far end of Bronzeville, foreclosed, windows boarded, a raccoon living in what used to be the dining room. I bought it with almost everything I had left after the divorce settlement, working the renovation myself on nights and weekends. The same hands that used to frame houses for other people, finally framing something of my own. 5 months later, I sold it for a profit of $32,000. I remember running into Nova at Zion's school pickup not long after that. I mentioned, casually, that I'd closed on the sale. She laughed, not cruelly, just that same tired, dismissive laugh she used to give me across the dinner table. "Still chasing dreams, Nazir? That's cute." Her eyes, though, flicked down to my hands for just a half-second before she looked away. I noticed it even then, though I didn't understand yet what it meant. I didn't correct her. I've learned something about quiet men. We don't need an audience to know we're right. We just need time. My mother used to say something, rocking on the porch swing outside her house in Bronzeville, the one that had been creaking since Eisenhower was in office. "Baby, you don't argue with a fool holding a losing hand. You just wait for the cards to turn over." I thought about that a lot those months. I thought about her rolling out biscuit dough for the church potluck every third Sunday, flour dusted up to her elbows, telling me patience wasn't about doing nothing. It was about doing everything right while nobody's watching. That's what those months were for me. Doing everything right while nobody was watching. And by the time that first year of building started closing out, the quiet work had already started adding up faster than I'd let myself admit. By the end of that year, I'd flipped 2 more properties. I'd started buying small multi-unit buildings other investors overlooked because they didn't want to deal with tenants, with permits, with the slow grind of it. I did the grind. I was built for the grind. 11 years of marriage had trained me for exactly that, whether Nova meant it to or not. And through all of it, every single weekend, Zion and I built something else too. Pancakes on Saturday mornings, homework at the kitchen table, her laughing so hard at my terrible cooking she'd fall right out of her chair. She started keeping a little notebook where she wrote down daddy facts. Things like, "Daddy can fix anything," and "Daddy doesn't yell, ever." I found that notebook by accident one night and had to sit on the edge of her bed for a good 10 minutes before I trusted my voice again. Nova had no idea any of this was happening. She thought I'd disappeared quietly into the background of her new life, exactly the way she'd expected. She had no idea I was building something with numbers on paper that would, within a year, put my name in a national business magazine. She thought the story was over. It was only just beginning. And the next time Nova and I sat across a table from each other, I wasn't going to be the man holding an empty glass anymore. Nasir sat on that recording of my wife calling him a lost cause for 3 whole years without ever confronting her with it, just quietly building his empire behind her back instead. Comment below. Was that patience? Or was he playing the exact same game of hiding the truth that he'd later drag Nova through the mud for? Team patience or team he should have said something? Pick your side. 7 months after the divorce was finalized, Nova asked to meet at a coffee shop on the Magnificent Mile to discuss custody. She brought her lawyer. I should have expected that. Nova never walked into a room without leverage if she could help it. I got there first. I chose a table by the window on purpose, the kind of morning light that makes everything look a little more honest than it usually is. I wore a simple button-down, sleeves rolled, nothing fancy. I wasn't there to prove anything with my clothes. Not yet. I ordered a black coffee, wrapped both hands around the cup, and watched the steam curl up between my fingers, trying to steady the small tremor that had crept into them the moment I saw her car pull up outside. Nova walked in 11 minutes late, her lawyer trailing a half-step behind her, carrying a leather folio thick enough to make a point of its own. She sat down, crossed her legs, and didn't waste time on pleasantries. Her nails, I noticed, were tapping a quick, uneven rhythm against the side of her own cup. a habit I remembered from years of watching her negotiate on the phone with vendors. She was nervous. She just hadn't figured out why yet. "We need to talk about increasing child support," she said. "Given your situation." "My situation," I repeated. "You're unemployed, Nasir. Everyone knows that." She said it lightly, almost bored, the same tone she'd used the night she called me useless. "You're still useless, aren't you? Just in a different apartment now." I want you to picture this. 11 years of marriage. A man who worked 2 jobs, who buried his father with his own 2 hands practically, who never once raised his voice. Sitting across from the woman who measured his worth in a coffee shop with her lawyer taking notes. I didn't raise my voice this time either. I looked her dead in the eye. "Do you remember the year Zion had pneumonia?" I asked. My voice came out steadier than I felt, the words rising up from somewhere I'd kept sealed for years. 9 years old, oxygen tent, that whole terrible week. I slept on a bench in that hospital hallway for 11 nights straight because they wouldn't let me stay in the room after visiting hours. I sold my truck to cover what our insurance didn't. You came by for 20 minutes between meetings, kissed her forehead, and left for a client dinner. I let that sit for a moment, watching her lawyer's pen hover, unmoving, above his legal pad. "And today you're telling me I'm still useless?" Nova's mouth opened slightly. Her lawyer glanced at her, then at his legal pad, and wrote nothing down. That's when I reached into my bag and set a folder on the table between us. Not thrown, not slammed, just placed, the way you'd set down something you'd been carrying a long time and were finally ready to put down. "What is this?" Nova asked, her voice a half step less certain than it had been 30 seconds earlier. "Take a look." Inside was a profit and loss statement showing $214,000 in net earnings over the past year. Behind it, a signed purchase agreement for a 12-unit apartment building on the near west side, closing in 3 weeks. I watched the color drain out of her face in real time. That particular kind of pale that has nothing to do with lighting and everything to do with a person's whole understanding of reality shifting underneath them. Her hand, resting on the table, went still, then curled slowly into a fist, knuckles whitening around nothing at all. I understood, watching her in that moment, that Nova's contempt had never really been about me. It was about fear. The quiet, gnawing dread of a woman raised to measure her own worth against someone else's paycheck, someone else's title, someone else's corner office in Naperville. Calling me useless had let her feel safe, superior, in control of a story where she was the one who'd chosen well. That folder didn't just show her a number. It took away the only measuring stick she'd ever known how to read herself by. And for a woman who'd built her entire identity on being the one who saw talent before anyone else did, discovering she'd missed it in her own house must have felt less like losing an argument and more like losing herself. "This is," she started and stopped. "That's real," I said. "Every number." Her lawyer, to his credit, was the first to recover. He cleared his throat and started talking about revised custody frameworks now that financial circumstances had changed. But I could see Nova wasn't listening to him anymore. She was staring at that purchase agreement like it was written in a language she'd forgotten she used to speak. The language of possibility, of somebody exceeding every ceiling she'd ever put over his head. Here's something I need you to understand about that moment, because it wasn't about the money. Not really. It was about 11 years of being told in 100 small ways that I was the ceiling in that marriage instead of the floor. It was about a woman who never once thought to ask what I might build if she just believed in me the way I'd believed in her, every single day, without condition. "You never asked me what I wanted for myself, Nova," I said quietly. "Not once, in 11 years. You just decided what I was, and then got tired of what you'd decided." She didn't have an answer for that. For the first time since I'd known her, Nova Thompson didn't have anything ready to say. She just sat there, staring down at her own hands like she was seeing them, and maybe herself for the first time in a long while. I gathered the folder, slid it back into my bag, and stood. "We can discuss custody through our attorneys," I said. "I'm not interested in fighting you for sport. I want what's fair for Zion. That's all I've ever wanted." I walked out onto Michigan Avenue into that thin April sunlight, and I want to tell you, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt something quieter than that. Something like a held breath finally let go. I need to back up for a second, though, because there's a piece of this you should know. Something that had happened 3 weeks before that coffee shop meeting. Something that made me walk in there with steadier hands than I'd expected to have. Imani had called me on a Sunday evening, her voice tight in a way I didn't recognize. "Nasir, I need to tell you something," she said. "Nova reached out to me last month. She wanted me to help her find out who you were working with. Investors, contractors, anybody. She said she wanted to know if you were actually doing something real or just playing pretend to embarrass her." I sat with that for a long moment. Not because it surprised me. By then, very little about the woman who used to be my wife surprised me anymore. But because it confirmed something I'd suspected without wanting to believe it. Even after the divorce, even after she'd walked away calling me useless, some part of her needed to keep tabs on whether I was actually succeeding. Because my failure had become part of how she understood herself. "What did you tell her?" I asked. "I told her to ask you herself," Imani said. And then I hung up. That's my sister for you. Loyal to the bone, sharp enough to see through anything, and never once willing to hand Nova a single piece of ammunition, even when it would have been easy. So when I sat across from Nova in that coffee shop with the folder between us, I wasn't just presenting numbers. I was closing a door she'd been trying to peek through for weeks, uninvited. That night, I picked Zion up for our weekend, and she noticed something different in my face before I'd even said a word. "Daddy, you look happy," she said, climbing into the truck. "I am, baby girl," I told her. "I really am." We drove to get ice cream, the two of us, windows cracked, her favorite gospel playlist humming low on the radio, something my mother used to play on Sunday mornings while she rolled out biscuit dough, flour on her apron, humming along off-key and not caring one bit. I glanced over at Zion, licking Rocky Road off her spoon, completely unaware that her father had just walked out of a coffee shop, having changed the entire direction of his life. But Nova wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. Because pride doesn't fold quietly, and there was one more room, one more audience, where she was about to find out just how far she'd underestimated me. You think that coffee shop was hard for her? Wait until you see what happens at Zion's 10th birthday party. Because that's where everything finally comes out into the open, in front of everyone who ever doubted me. Zion's 10th birthday party was held at Nova's house. The house that used to be mine, too, with the porch swing still creaking on that same crooked chain I never got around to fixing. Nova's whole family was there. Her parents, her brother, aunts and cousins I hadn't seen since the divorce, all gathered under string lights in the backyard, paper streamers looped between the fence posts. I arrived a little late, straight from a closing downtown, still in the dark gray suit I'd worn to sign the papers on that near West Side building. I hadn't planned it that way. That's just how the day fell. But I noticed the way conversation dipped for a second when I walked through the gate. Someone's fork stopped halfway to their mouth. A cousin nudged another cousin, low, not quiet enough. Nova's brother was the first to say something. "Nasir, didn't expect to see you looking so sharp." There was a question underneath the compliment, the kind people ask without asking. "Just came from closing on a building downtown," I said, setting Zion's present on the gift table. That's all it took. One sentence, said plainly, no bragging in it. But I watched it move through that backyard like a current. Heads turning, someone's aunt leaning over to whisper to another, Nova's father raising an eyebrow over his lemonade. Nova came over a few minutes later, a champagne flute in her hand, her smile a little too fixed at the corners. "Closing on a building," she repeated. "That's nice, Nasir." I looked at her, calm, the way I'd learned to be calm over the past year. "Do you remember 4 years ago, when I wanted to put money into that vacant lot over in Woodlawn, a couple blocks off Jackson Park? You laughed, told me property over there would never be worth the paper on the deed." I paused. It's worth nearly 8 times what it was back then now. The whole neighborhood's turned around since they broke ground on the Obama Presidential Center. I listened to you instead of myself that time. Cost me a real opportunity. Her hand trembled, just slightly, around the stem of that champagne flute. Enough that a little spilled over the rim onto her fingers. She didn't say anything. She set the glass down on the nearest table, too carefully, like she didn't trust her own grip anymore. That's when Imani, standing near the dessert table, decided she'd had enough of staying quiet. "Since we're being honest today," Imani said, loud enough for half the backyard to hear, "maybe somebody should mention that Nova's been keeping money from the joint accounts hidden for the past 2 years, and talking about Nasir behind his back to anybody who'd listen, calling him a failure, right up until about 3 weeks ago when she found out he wasn't." The backyard went dead quiet. Somewhere behind me, I heard ice clink in a glass, too loud in the silence. A string light flickered overhead, buzzing faintly, the only sound for what felt like a full 10 seconds. "Imani, that's not—" Nova started, but her voice cracked in the middle of it, and everyone heard it crack. "I want to tell you, I didn't ask my sister to say that. I wouldn't have. Public humiliation was never the goal for me. I'd spent too many years on the receiving end of quiet cruelty to want to hand it back on purpose. But I understood, standing there, that some truths have their own timing, and Imani had simply run out of patience for watching Nova rewrite the last decade of my life in front of people who never knew the real story. Nova set her champagne flute down on the table, hard enough that it nearly tipped. Her eyes were bright and not from happiness. And then Zion, my daughter, 10 years old that very day, in a yellow dress with her hair in 2 neat braids, walked straight across that backyard, past her mother, past every adult standing there frozen, and wrapped both arms around my waist in front of everyone. "Daddy is not useless," she said, loud and clear, her voice carrying over the whole quiet yard. "Daddy is the hardest working man I know." I have stood on construction sites in January wind that could cut through 3 layers of clothing. I have sat in a hospital hallway for 11 nights straight. I have signed contracts worth more money than I used to make in 5 years combined. None of it prepared me for the way my chest felt in that moment, my daughter's arms around me, her small voice defending me in front of a yard full of people who'd spent a year believing the worst. My throat closed up, and for a second I couldn't have spoken even if I'd wanted to. I knelt down and hugged her back, and for a second I forgot anybody else was there at all. Somewhere in that silence, small and strange, I thought of the notebook hidden in her room. Daddy can fix anything. And understood, finally, exactly what she'd meant by it. When I finally looked up, Nova was gone. She'd slipped out through the side gate, and I heard her car start in the driveway a moment later, tires a little too fast pulling out onto the street. Nobody chased after her. Not her parents, not her brother. The silence that followed wasn't awkward so much as it was the kind of silence that comes after something true finally gets said out loud in a room that's been avoiding it for a long time. Looking back, I think I finally understood why Nova had hidden that money for 2 years instead of just spending it, or leaving it alone entirely. Fear does strange things to people who've built their whole identity on appearing like they have everything handled. Hiding cash wasn't greed, not really. It was a woman quietly building herself an exit ramp, in case the version of her life she performed in front of her family ever cracked open. And it did crack, that night, right there in front of the very people whose approval she'd spent her whole life chasing. The same audience she'd once used me to measure herself against. I didn't feel joy watching it happen. I felt what you feel watching a house you used to live in finally show its cracks. Sad and a little relieved you're not the one still holding up the walls. I want to be honest with you about something. I didn't feel victorious watching her leave that party. I felt something closer to sad. Sad for the version of Nova who used to laugh easily, who I fell in love with at a block party on 47th Street when we were both 23 and broke and certain the whole world was ahead of us. Somewhere along the way, ambition had curdled into something that measured love in dollar signs. And I don't think she ever meant to become that. I think it just happened to her slowly, the way rust happens to a fence nobody paints. But I also felt, for the first time in longer than I could remember, completely unashamed of who I was. Later that evening, after the party wound down and I'd driven Zion back to my apartment for our weekend together, she fell asleep on the couch halfway through a cartoon, my arm gone numb underneath her. I sat there a long while, not moving, just watching her breathe. My phone buzzed once. A text from Imani. Sorry if I went too far today. She had it coming, though. I typed back, You didn't go too far. You told the truth. There's a difference. I set the phone down and looked out my apartment window at the Bronzeville streetlights, at a city that had shaped every hard thing about me, and every good thing, too. I thought about my father, gone 3 years now, who used to say a man's character shows up loudest in the rooms he doesn't think anybody's watching. Well, a whole backyard had been watching that day. And for once, what they saw was exactly who I really was. But the story wasn't finished, not for Nova, and not for me. Because pride, once it breaks all the way open in public, doesn't just quietly heal on its own. What happens next changes both of us for good. And it starts with a phone call I never expected to answer. I didn't go after Nova for everything I could have. My lawyer laid out the numbers, told me what I was entitled to pursue given the joint accounts Imani had exposed, given the financial picture that had shifted so completely in the past year. I listened, thanked him, and asked for something simpler. Primary custody of Zion, I said, and a fair, reasonable division of what's left. Nothing punitive. He looked at me like I'd left money on the table. Because I had. But money was never really what this had been about for me, not underneath it all. I wanted my daughter home with me most nights. I wanted to stop measuring myself against a ledger somebody else kept. Everything past that felt like carrying weight I didn't need anymore. The court agreed to the custody arrangement within 2 months. Nova, facing debts from the accounts she'd hidden, and the financial strain of maintaining a house built for a 2-income household on 1 salary, sold the place on the south side and moved into a smaller apartment over in Englewood, not far from where she'd grown up visiting her grandmother most summers. I bought back the old Bronzeville 2-flat that had been in my family since my grandfather's time. The one where I grew up hearing that porch swing creak on summer evenings while my mother snapped green beans into a bowl on her lap. I fixed it up, slow and careful, the way you restore something that matters instead of something you're flipping for profit. The ground floor became the first real office for my company. I hung my grandfather's old level on the wall by my desk, the same one he used building that 2-flat with his own hands 60 years earlier. Some things you keep, not because you need them, but because they remind you where you started. There was a quiet Sunday evening around that time I still hold on to. The office empty, just me sweeping sawdust off the new floors after the last of the contractors had gone home. I stood there a moment in the settling dust, the last light coming gold through the front window, and let myself feel the whole weight of the year finally arrive all at once. Not as grief anymore, just as something I'd carried and set down safely. I whispered, mostly to my father, "We did it, Pop." Nobody answered. I didn't need them to. It was around that time I met Jada Reynolds. She was the architect brought in to consult on the renovation, recommended by Pastor Brooks, who apparently knew everyone worth knowing on the South Side. Jada had a quiet, steady way about her. She'd ask a question, actually wait for the whole answer, and never once made me feel like I needed to prove anything to earn her respect. It was disorienting at first, honestly, being around someone who simply took my word as good without needing receipts. A few weeks into working together, she mentioned something over coffee, almost in passing. "Your ex-wife called me a while back," Jada said, "before we started working together. She wanted to warn me off you, said you weren't who I thought you were, that I should be careful getting involved in business with you." I set my cup down slowly. "What did you tell her?" "I told her I make my own judgments about people based on how they actually treat me," Jada said, "and that I wasn't interested in second-hand opinions about a man I hadn't even met yet." I sat with that for a moment, watching steam curl up off my coffee. Somewhere in me, something loosened that had been tight for a very long time. The fear, I think, that no matter how far I got, Nova's version of me would always find a way to follow me into every new room. Jada had simply closed the door on that before it ever got the chance to open. "Thank you for telling me," I said. "I figured you should know the kind of person you're building this with," she said. And there was nothing dramatic in the way she said it, just plain, steady honesty. The kind I hadn't realized I'd been missing for 11 years of marriage. I want to be clear about something, because it matters. I didn't build anything to spite Nova. I know how that story sounds from the outside. Wronged man rises, gets his revenge, humiliates the woman who doubted him. That's not what this was, not by the end of it. I built because I had a daughter who deserved to see her father stand up straight after being knocked down. I built because somewhere along the way, the work itself, the flipping, the negotiating, the slow, patient math of turning a broken building into something whole again, stopped being about proving anyone wrong and became something I simply loved doing, for its own sake. That shift matters more than any number on a Forbes list, if I'm honest with you. My mother used to tell me, rolling dough on that same porch table, flour dusted to her elbows, "Baby, don't you dare build your whole self around getting even. Build yourself around getting whole. The rest just follows." I didn't understand what she meant until I was 38 years old, sitting in an office I owned, in a building I'd restored with my own two hands, finally understanding the difference between those two things. Zion started spending most nights at my place after the custody arrangement settled. She decorated her room herself. String lights, a corkboard covered in drawings, a small shelf where she kept that notebook of daddy facts she thought I didn't know about. Some Saturday mornings, Jada would come by, and the three of us would make pancakes together. Zion standing on a step stool, insisting she was the official flipper. Batter occasionally landing somewhere other than the pan. It was a small, ordinary kind of happiness. After everything, that's what surprised me most. How quiet real peace actually is. Nobody warns you that healing doesn't come with fireworks. It comes with pancake batter on the ceiling and your daughter laughing so hard she can't breathe. But there was one more conversation waiting for me. One I didn't ask for and didn't expect. The last time I would ever have to explain myself to Nova Thompson. A year to the day after Nova told me I was useless, I sat in my office in the Loop with the morning light coming in low through the windows. And on my desk was a printed copy of the Forbes feature, my name on a list of the country's top young real estate entrepreneurs. A small photo of me standing in front of that first Bronzeville 2-flat I'd bought, with almost nothing left to my name. Zion burst through the office door that afternoon, backpack still on, out of breath from running up from the car. "Daddy, my teacher said you're famous. She showed the class the article." I picked her up, even though she insisted every week now that she was getting too big for that. I held her a long moment, looking past her out the window at the Chicago skyline. A city that had shaped every hard year and every good one. The same streets I'd grown up on. The same river Nova used to mention with pride from her old office window. Everything I'd carried quietly. The hospital hallway. My father's illness. The whispered phone call I overheard in a hallway years earlier. The USB drive I never played for anyone but myself. All of it had shaped something in me I couldn't have built any other way. I'm not saying I'd choose to go through it again. I'm saying I understand now what my mother meant about getting whole instead of getting even. That evening, Nova texted asking to meet one last time. Just to talk, she said. I almost said no. Then I thought about what closure was actually worth, for both of us, and I agreed. We met at a small diner in Bronzeville, nothing fancy, the kind of place with vinyl booths and coffee that never runs out. Nova looked different than she had at that birthday party. Thinner, tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. Her hands, when she wrapped them around her coffee cup, looked smaller than I remembered, like something in her had shrunk down along with everything else she'd lost. "I saw the article," she said, before I'd even sat down all the way. "I figured you might." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup like she needed something to hold on to. "I have to tell you something, Nasir. Before the Forbes piece ran, I reached out to a reporter I knew from an old work contact. I tried to get them to run something negative about you instead. Said you were unstable, that the business wasn't what it looked like." She looked down at the table. "They didn't listen to me. They ran your story anyway, because it was true." I sat with that for a moment. I wasn't angry, which surprised me more than her confession did. Some part of me, quietly, had almost expected it. I thought back to that flicker in her eyes at Zion's school pickup, the way she'd glanced at my hands and looked away too fast. I understood now what that look had been. Fear, dressed up as scorn. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because I lost everything trying to keep you small," she said, her voice breaking on the last word. "The house, most of my family's respect,
And I still couldn't stop you from becoming exactly what I always said you'd never be. I looked at her. Really looked. The way you look at someone who was once my wife, whose worst moment you're witnessing instead of celebrating. You called me useless, I said quietly. Today, I forgive you. Not because what you did was okay, but because I'm not that man anymore, and I don't want to carry you around inside me for one more year. I didn't say it to hurt her. I said it because it was simply true. And because true things, said plainly, tend to be the kindest thing you can offer somebody at the end of something. I paid for both our coffees, stood, and walked out into a clear Chicago evening, sunlight cutting long and gold across the sidewalk. Zion was waiting for me in the truck, headphones on, humming along to something off-key, exactly the way my mother used to hum on that porch swing years and years ago. I got in, reached over, and squeezed her hand. I blocked Nova's number that night, not out of anger, out of peace. Some doors close best when you close them gently and just keep walking. This story reminds us that quiet dignity isn't handed to us. It's built, one deliberate habit at a time. If you've ever felt overlooked in your own home, try this. Every Sunday evening before supper, set one extra placemat at the table, not out of grief, but out of gratitude, and write in a 5-cent notebook from the pharmacy one thing you did that day nobody applauded, but mattered anyway. When the grandchildren visit, let them watch you do it without explaining why. Children learn dignity by watching it practiced quietly, not by being lectured about it. The next time someone, a son-in-law, a neighbor, an old friend, tells you what you're no longer capable of, don't argue back. Just keep setting that placemat. Some Tuesdays the proof takes a year to arrive. It arrives anyway. That's what patient love looks like, decades in. Not loud, not asking anyone's permission, just steady as an old porch swing that's still holding on. These are authentic human stories, shaped by real pain and real dreams. AI helped with grammar, flow, and structure. But the heart, the moral weight, and the life-changing lessons belong entirely to the human creators and their audience. Production team, story and screenplay by Quinn Fung. Character development and visual conceptualization by Chris Nguyen. Video scripting and scene adaptation by David Nguyen. A passionate team dedicated to bringing this story to life.